And I'd just like to say a quick thank you to one of our silver sponsors, Prowler, who's the leading open source tool for multi-cloud security best practices assessment, auditing, and hardening. So it helps identify vulnerabilities, ensures compliance, and improves cloud security posture with comprehensive checks and actionable insights. So AWS recommends Prowler for its robust security and compliance management capabilities. So thank you, Prowler. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Christian Philipov from With Secure Consulting and Staying Sneaky in Azure. Thank you.
All right. Well, welcome everybody to my talk on Staying Sneaky in Azure. I've got the infamous after lunch slot, so I'll try and keep it lively and interesting for you all so that nobody falls asleep too quickly. And I'll try to avoid going on too many tangents. Like all the people that know me know that I tend to do that, so I'll try and keep it focused. So, what are we going to talk about? Well, we're first going to talk about a bit of a TLDR, mainly to make sure that I catch everybody's attention before they fall asleep, and then continue on with the rest of the talk. Then we're going to explore a bit about how these Azure APIs, the ones that we're going to talk about, how you can use them as part of like assessments, reviews, and understand why they might be used by attackers and what we can do to focus our defensive efforts to try and mitigate some of these issues. Then we'll talk about some recommendations to try and tackle the identified problems that we're going to talk about during this presentation, and then we're just going to finish off with a summary. So a lot of things to do in a fairly short amount of time, so let's get going. But before that, obligatory who am I slide, but basically I'm Chris Philipov, a principal security consultant at With Secure Consulting, and I do a lot of cloud, if it's not obvious. I also head up our kind of cloud capability area within the company. I focus mainly on Azure and GCP, but AWS unfortunately still finds me every now and again. Trust policies are annoying, but all that aside, let's start with the TLDR that I promised. So overall, the situation can seem a bit bleak with the various complexity present within Azure and Entra. However, I don't really think we're in that bad of a shape, and Microsoft are clearly making an effort to try and improve and mitigate these gaps that exist with regards to detection capabilities, especially for read and enumeration actions. People that have worked with Azure know that a lot of the audit logging generally captures all state-changing activities across the various services, but in terms of read activities and enumeration, that's always been a bit of a blind spot. Recently, there's been work with the new graph activity logs that were released in November last year that give you a better glimpse into all the actions performed against the Microsoft Graph endpoint, which is the modern kind of base, the main kind of trunk of Entra and Azure, with pretty much anything that's related to tenant management. In essence, with the complexity with the platform, there are lots of interesting APIs that exist under the hood. It's not only Microsoft Graph or the Azure AD Graph, there's a lot more, and can be used for legitimate and less legitimate reasons. There are so many that I'm pretty confident to make a prediction that there will be many talks after this with regards to like new APIs that people discover and new capabilities that exist that can be used for malicious purposes and might be a bit of a blind spot with regards to kind of detections. And some of these examples that we're going to talk about today will cover that. Now that we've started a bit kind of Benjamin Button style at the end, let's catch up everybody so that we can see what's going on. So, how we got to this research? Well, there's a lot of really awesome research done in the recent years. You've got Nick Frechette's talk in 2023 on evading logging in the cloud, kind of showcasing how even within AWS, you've got all sorts of API endpoints, both kind of the regular production ones and also ones that might not be completely production that can be used to avoid or in general kind of change the way that certain events are logged in CloudTrail. This year's Forward CloudSec in the US, you've also got Aled Mehta's talk on his project on nodoc.cloud. Recommend checking that out. But in general, where he covers he tries to document this kind of less known API, the Ibiza API, that's used by the Azure portal, and seeing how what capabilities are exist to that, and try and kind of peer through the darkness and actually shed some light on that. Which we're going to do a bit as well during this talk. In essence, I just kind of got jealous of everybody doing cool API research. So instead of actually doing my day-to-day tasks, I ended up kind of looking into this a bit more. So what's the problem? Well, Entra in Azure is a very large cloud provider. Obviously, there is a big market share here to play with and a lot of services that the Azure provides to you. But there is a lot of hidden complexity that has been built up from the ground up, likely because different teams obviously operating on different core services. There's the factor of acquisitions that have been made over the years by Microsoft that then get integrated into the cloud platform. And overall, you've got all these APIs that power these services under the hood that you have to take note of. Then you've also got the whole separation between Entra in terms of Microsoft Graph and then Azure with the Azure Services APIs. So there's a lot of that fundamental separation of these two, but then there is a lot of crossplay and kind of overlap between the functionalities that these APIs need to provide to be able to function. And I think that that's exactly an excellent example. What the APIs that we're going to discuss about are excellent examples of those that kind of cross that boundary and overlap in terms of the capabilities they offer. So we're going to talk about two APIs specifically. On the left, you've got the Ibiza API that Alan talked about in his talk at the US, but it's effectively an extension API meant kind of for the main Azure portal, used to support a lot of the operations done then that way. And then on the right side, you've got the Privileged Identity Management API that underpins kind of the whole PIM service in general within Entra and Azure. For the people that aren't as familiar with it, PIM is a very useful service for kind of managing permissions within the tenant by putting in controls such as like time limiting or putting in like an enforced like approval workflow before a certain role can be activated. So it's very much used in a lot of enterprise settings, and oh no, it's a definitely useful service. Now, why are these two APIs interesting? So let me talk you through a bit of an example. Let's kind of set the scene. So we've managed to compromise a user and are aiming to enumerate what's available within a tenant, and also what permissions we've got, and obviously kind of what's overall there that we can use. Now, one good approach to do to start off with is using Azure Hound to grab information about the tenant, grab information about some of the Azure resources, and try and graph out kind of the ways that these different entities and objects relate to each other. Kind of what sort of roles are available, what groups, what users, etc., etc. Absolutely a useful tool, 100% kind of a good starting point, but it is a bit noisy, especially with the new graph activity logs. This is just an example of running Azure Hound twice, because the first time I didn't properly do it, but the second time worked out well. So overall, you can see that there's a lot of requests that get sent to the Graph API endpoint to enumerate these different objects within the tenant. And I would also recommend checking out the blog linked there in the QR code and in the URL from Fabian, who's a Microsoft MVP, that actually published some of the KQL that they used to generate this specific table. And overall has got some excellent ideas and approaches for how to use the new graph activity logs to actually start doing some detection engineering around these enumeration activities within the tenant. Now, this is 100% a good thing that Microsoft is doing. Having this capability is by far like an incredible step to actually allow us to spot like attackers doing their initial access activities within a tenant. But let's look at the good example where one thing can be done in a couple different ways and see whether or not the logging is the same in those two. So one really quick example with MS Graph, we've got a role management estimate access API endpoint that we can hit, which basically you provide in the post body about 20 requests, well, 20 permissions per request, and then you get a response back that says whether an action is invalid, whether it's not allowed or allowed. So ultimately, if you want to cover a lot of the Entra ID permissions, you need about 11 requests to be able to do it, and that should give you a full map of kind of what the the current logged in user that you're issuing the request with has access. That's great. 11 request isn't too much, but it's still something, especially at scale, where you can use it as part of some of your detection engineering. And also logged in the graph activity logs. Excellent, good start. Let's do the same thing with the Ibiza API instead. So we've got a different API endpoint, which is API/permissions, which gives us actually a nice, well-formatted list of all the actions that signed-in user principal can perform against the tenant with the respective kind of verb actions such as read, create, update, or delete. And instead of 11, we need only one API call, and it's not logged in the graph activity logs because it basically gets sent to the Ibiza API that handles it, then gives you the response, and it has underlying access to be able to figure out kind of what sort of permissions the calling principal has against the tenant. Okay, not ideal. How about if we try and enumerate what sort of users there are? Well, there's an Ibiza API endpoint for that as well. So now, for one API call for 999 users at a time, we can enumerate the entire tenant to capture this basic information about what sort of users exist within the environment, what their object IDs are, that's going to be relevant for the next one, and also other properties of that user object as well. And also not logged in the graph activity logs. It might require a good amount of API calls if it's only 1,000 users per request, but if none of it is logged, then in practice, you'll be fine. Okay. How about what other roles other users have? Well, we can do that as well, because we've got the API/roles endpoint where we can ask for a given user with their object ID, what role assignments do they have at the tenant level, and we've got a nice list of all the permissions and any predefined roles that are applied to them, and you can have that for every user within the tenant. So all in all, we've managed to cover a lot of ground, similar to what Azure Hound does, but none of it is logged in the graph activity logs because it's all against the Ibiza API, which doesn't provide that in any of the available kind of audit logs within Azure or Entra. Okay, let's do one last one. So we want to check the members of a security group. Let's assume that we've managed to go through the entire tenant. We found some security groups. We found a security group with a role assigned to it that we want to get to. So we want to figure out, okay, who has access to that group? We can use this Ibiza API endpoint to ask the number of members of a given group, and we find that it's 0. But realistically, is it actually 0? And that's where we do a slight intermission to PIM for a second. So to answer this quest, we need to discuss PIM for groups for just a bit. Like I mentioned already what PIM's capabilities are in terms of providing kind of time-limited access to roles or enforced controls on them. So typically, the main kind of initial services were to allow a user to be assigned a role and then made eligible for that role within Entra or within Azure. Then recently, there was a kind of a subservice component to it, which is PIM for groups, where now you can be made eligible to be a member of a security group. So by default, you aren't. So as far as the security group is concerned, it has no active members, but you can elevate through PIM to actually become a member. This is very useful, especially for enterprise contexts, where a lot of times role management is managed by assigning specific roles to security groups and then adding or removing people from those groups in an effort to try and minimize kind of people having excessive access without actually needing it. And you can enforce all the same restrictions on PIM for groups, always well with the world. Now, there is a bit of a problem with it. And in essence, I mean, all of us in the room here will know that privileged access management is hard functionally. Like, it's a lot of times people end up getting a lot of access in a short amount of time, and then that access usually doesn't get removed for a longer period than most people would like. So it's important to know at any one point in time kind of what principals have access to these privileged roles within your organization. Now, PIM for groups makes this a bit hard since only specific privileged roles can actually see the members, well, the eligible members of a group via PIM. So for example, if a lot of your security staff has, let's say, security reader permissions assigned at the tenant level to try and capture and look at some of these misconfigurations on a more ad hoc basis or kind of a continuous basis even, then with security reader, you can't really see it because it doesn't allow you to actually see the eligible members. So from a read-only role perspective, it's mostly global readers that can actually see the members of this group. And so let's use the PIM API to try and actually figure this thing out. So using the PIM API, we can go and ask PIM, okay, what are the groups that you manage via PIM for groups? And it can give you a nice list of all the groups that are added there. And we can see there that we've got the group that we think is empty so far as one of the ones that are managed by PIM. So we can go like, there might be something there. So it's worth having a look at. And then we can use a different PIM API request to then get all the eligible members of that group and also give us the count. And we can see, using that in reality, even though the group shows up as empty, and if you go through the portal as well, unless somebody's activated, you won't basically see anybody there. You can see that actually there are 5 users in the entire tenant that have that access. So then you, as an attacker, can go and figure out, obviously which of those users can you target or get to, but also as a defender, you can then review whether or not those users should have that role or whether or not it was given at some point in the past and maybe isn't as necessary nowadays. Can we actually detect this? I think you all know the answer to this one. But in essence, because, again, we're hitting the PIM API directly and not through Microsoft Graph, then not really. Because, again, these enumeration activities won't show in the Graph activity logs. If we had done kind of the equivalent Microsoft Graph endpoint requests to try and get eligible members of a group, then it would have showed up in the Graph activity logs, but interacting with the PIM API directly kind of bypasses that. So from an enumeration perspective, at least, we definitely have this kind of gap where we really can't trust that we have full coverage of what people are enumerating and reading within the tenant. Obviously, state-changing actions in PIM are very much still logged and available within the audit logs for the service, but enumeration is definitely a bit of a gap there. So what's the ways that we can try and tackle this? Well, as I said at the beginning, Microsoft is definitely getting better at this, and the Graph activity logs is 100% a step forward, but there just isn't full coverage yet because of this complexity of the amount of APIs under the hood that drive a lot of these services and the tenant. And so you ultimately need to rely on other enrichment options to try and use this detection or build up your detections to capture that. In practice, I would recommend that organizations first focus on actually developing detections around state-changing activities first, which are more readily available within the logs, and you can actually do stuff with it. It's not going to be as valuable trying to capture this very hard and nuanced way of enumerating resources if you're not alerting on, for example, somebody just getting assigned global admin directly as a role assignment. There are definitely bigger fish to fry, but as a whole, there are definitely ways that we can try and capture some of this enumeration activities. So for example, if you've got usually kind of a managed estate where you've enforced access to only be via managed devices or onboarded devices with kind of an EDR sort of sensor, then you can try and look at what sort of telemetry is available from the endpoints themselves and try and use that to capture whether or not somebody's excessively hitting these kind of known or more known APIs than they were 20 minutes ago, and try and see if you can kind of make some detections around that, some thresholding in terms of how many requests are being done that would be excessive in comparison to somebody, for example, just using the portal or kind of doing the whole ClickOps thing and managing stuff through the just dashboard online. Now, overall, as a summary, I think we can clearly see that there are many ways to perform a given action within Azure. In this case, we're just exploring a fraction of what is available behind these APIs. I'm 100% certain that there is more stuff to be discovered. But in general, I think we need to challenge our assumptions in terms of what the Graph SDK and the Azure APIs kind of offer you out of the box in terms of capabilities and logging, and just make sure that we investigate and better understand the internals and how these APIs actually get used. Because I think that that is definitely going to become more and more of a gap that people are going to try and explore and as well as exploit. So it's important that we as defenders actually get there first, figure these things out, document what we can, and figure out where these specific gaps exist so that at least you are aware of what is going to be a functional kind of platform issue that you need to work around and build some detections for. And with that, it's the end of the talk.
Amazing. Thank you, Christian. So we'll take a question from Slack. How long have these APIs been around? Do you see Azure adding new ones that don't get properly logged?
So in terms of how long these APIs have been around, I can't really give kind of concrete dates, but definitely for a good few years. Effectively, these APIs basically underpin a lot of the kind of core services available there. The Ibiza API is used within the portal, and I think it's been around for many years, realistically. The PIM one, probably ever so slightly newer, I think, in comparison to the Ibiza one, but obviously don't quote me on that.
Thank you. Any other questions from the crowd?
Thank you. Really enjoyed the talk. Question from me. Did you encounter areas where the Azure portal was using the Ibiza or the PIM APIs in a way that it would bypass its own, hoped for logging through the Graph APIs?
So not really. In essence, wherever possible, I've seen that like Microsoft has been trying to update the portal, for example, to use a lot of the Graph kind of endpoint to perform a lot of these activities behind the scenes, so that stuff does get logged. There are definitely still requests that go through the actual individual kind of service APIs through the portal. If you go and kind of visit it and proxy all the traffic, you'll definitely notice them. But I think that there's been some definite work done to kind of move away as much as possible from it. For example, the Azure AD Graph, which is the older graph model, is like in comparison to a couple of years ago, I think that there's definitely a lot less stuff from the portal that actually goes there, and instead they try to push everything through the Graph API. So it's very possible that in the future that this is going to change and some of this functionality might not be available as much and kind of as readily available. But at the moment, it's still definitely something that does get used even just by somebody browsing through the portal.
Thank you.
Thank you. One more from Slack then. Did you report this to Microsoft? Because in AWS, running some actions that don't get logged into CloudTrail will definitely be considered as a vulnerability.
So this, not because this is functionally kind of how the platform kind of operates. Like functionally, this isn't anything new in and of itself. This is effectively how for example, the console would legitimately use these APIs under the hood to perform these activities. As mentioned before, historically, this has been a bit of a gap in terms of detection possibilities, because although all state-changing actions do get logged, it's exactly these enumeration activities just wasn't readily available for customers to actually ingest up until, as I said, like November last year. So very well, it could be that in the future, Microsoft does end up kind of improving a lot of these other API endpoints in the hood as well, so that a lot of that logging can be available to customers. But yeah, that's, I guess, the quick TLDR.
Okay, probably have time for one more from the room, if there is any. No? Okay, well, last one then is which of the APIs you've discussed could be fixed by Azure, and what would be the first fix they should release?
That's a good question. I would assume that the PIM API should be probably the one that can be a bit more unified in terms of what sort of logging is available. But obviously, I'm really taking a gander based on how the service operates and how kind of mature it is, at least on the outside. Obviously, from the inside, we don't know. It could be a very easy task. It could be a very challenging task, but I guess we'll see.
Okay, thank you so much, Chris. Appreciate it.